I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. The Summer Wellness Series is presented in partnership with the Taylor Institute for Teaching and Learning and the Campus Mental Health Strategy. Please note that this webinar will be recorded and published online to be viewed after. My name is Dr. Melissa Boyce, and I'm the Associate Dean, Undergraduate Programs and Student Affairs within the Faculty of Arts, as well as the Academic Coordinator of the Embedded Certificate in Mental Wellbeing and Resilience. I will be your moderator today. Feel free to use the chat box during the presentation to ask questions. There will be time at the end for Q&A, and we'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible. Please note that the chat box and your name display will be edited out of the final recording. All microphones and videos are turned off except for the facilitator to ensure your webinar experience is not disrupted with other video images or sounds. Note, if you unmute and speak into your microphone, your voice will be recorded. At this time, I want to introduce our first presenter of the Summer Wellness Series, Dr. Yunying Carpenter. Yunying is a senior instructor and associate head undergraduate in the Department of Chemistry. She's a trained chemist and science education researcher. Her research interests have included visualizations in chemistry education, peer reflection and scientific problem solving, and students' attitudes towards uncertainty and risk in design projects. She deeply believes in resilience as a result of community rather than self-care. Although newer to trauma-informed teaching, Yunying sees this model as an opportunity to make connections between student well-being and their learning. Yunying's well-being is currently supported by cuddling her dog, lifting heavy things, and being in virtual community with educators for whom love, rest, and wellness are foundational priorities in learning spaces. Welcome, Yunying, and over to you.
All right, so as I get started, I just want to emphasize that there's lots of wellness resources out there. And because we are talking about trauma, although we are focusing more on how to mitigate the impacts of trauma in our learning and working spaces, that I want to remind you that there are lots of resources out there. So if any of what we discussed today is triggering for you or brings up the need for additional supports, we've got a link here, and Sasha is also going to paste a couple of those links to some immediate support resources in the chat, just in case this is something that triggers some things for you personally, especially, and I know COVID and its experiences have been things that have brought us to this space as well. And some of those experiences may have been personally traumatizing as well. Before I dig in and get started, I do want to start with some thank yous. In particular, a lot of the way that I think and speak about trauma-informed teaching and trauma-informed workspaces is thanks to the mentorship of Alex Vanette. Her website and Twitter are posted here. She's an educator located in Vermont who specializes in equity-informed trauma-centered practice. I'm also really thankful to the organizational team who has supported the Summer Wellness Series, including the Campus Mental Health Strategy and the Taylor Institute, as well as especially Sasha, Andrew, Emily, Cheryl, and Melissa for all of their support in bringing this presentation together. And thank you to each of you for being here in this space in whatever way you are today. Okay. All right, so today, my goal is really to begin your journey into thinking about how our teaching and learning spaces and our campus can be more trauma-informed. So I want to talk about how trauma responses affect our learning and working, as well as sort of take a community-centered approach to how we design our learning and workspaces. I'm going to give us a model from Alex Vanette in terms of the priorities, the language, and the decision-making processes that we can use to make our spaces more trauma-informed, and really tie that into principles of equity, which hopefully will lead us into the next in our Summer Wellness Series with Dr. Melinda Smith in July. I do want to make a note I initially found this font somewhat jarring, getting used to it, but this is actually a font called Open Dyslexic, which is freely available online, which actually makes reading and not swapping letters typically more accessible for folks who experience dyslexia. So a note on that font for you guys. All right, so just to get us started and to center us in this space, I want to take a moment for us to check in with ourselves, with the energy that we're bringing into this space, because I know some of us may be teaching right now, some of us may be working with students directly right now, some of us may be in the middle of our busy season or in a season of rest. So I invite you to take a moment at the top of your screen where that little green and red bar is that says what's being screen shared to you. You'll see a little view options menu there and an opportunity to annotate. And I invite you to click on that annotate option and select a stamp of your choice and place it along this spectrum to indicate whether you're exhausted, energized, or somewhere in between. And I'll give you guys a moment to see where you're at today, how you're feeling, and where you land on this spectrum. All right, got a fair number of responses, and I'll invite you to take a look at that across the board and notice that the folks joining us in this space are all across this spectrum. Me, I'm a little closer to the exhausted end right now in my own self, but thinking about the energy that we're bringing, I invite you to participate to the extent that you are able. Take in what you need and take breaks as you need as we discuss some potentially heavy material, okay? I'm just gonna clear those annotations so that we can move on, all right? Great, fantastic. Thank you for participating in that. I also want to, as I mentioned early on, I invite you to be mindful about your own well-being. As we go through, as I mentioned, my focus is not on the causes of trauma, but some of these topics will get mentioned. And for some of you, that may trigger something in you. So feel free to rest, to take space, and participate only as maintains your own wellness, okay? All right, so let's dig in. I know we have a range of folks with a range of experiences here. So let's define together what trauma is for the purposes of this conversation. So trauma in particular is a response. So trauma is not the event that occurs, and not all stressful events are trauma. Trauma are things where that experience that someone has had, perhaps powerful and dangerous events, overwhelms a person's capacity to cope. And that definition is adapted from the National Childhood Trauma Network, as well as Education Northwest. I really want to emphasize this idea that it is not about singular events. So events may traumatize one individual and not another, but also that they don't have to be events that are a single moment in time. There are causes of trauma or traumatic influences that are much longer in span. So intergenerational or historical trauma, where folks, for example, of racialized backgrounds have experienced that through generations. It is not a single event that defines their trauma response, okay? When I think about the idea that trauma responses are highly individual and that we respond differently, I think about that in the context of COVID. Our lived experiences of the recent year and the past pandemic have been very different. But even for two people sharing the same lived experience, the way that they respond to that may be very, very different. And it is not our role as educators or as people interacting with someone who may have experienced trauma or with our colleagues to be trauma detectives. We are not seeking the sources. We are not trying to validate or judge if someone has or has not experienced trauma. We are trying to create spaces that do not exacerbate those traumas, but instead mitigate them. The responses that someone who's experienced trauma might display include over and under reaction, avoidance, challenges with self-regulation, impulsivity, trouble with decision-making, hypervigilance, perfectionism, physical symptoms as well, headaches, etc. But seeing those responses in our colleagues or in our students does not necessarily indicate trauma. And likewise, the absence of any of those examples does not necessarily indicate that someone is not experiencing trauma, is not traumatized. So really, these just give us some cues to this. Our goal really is to say that likely in any environment that we're in, whether a working space or a teaching space, that we may have individuals in our space that are experiencing or have experienced trauma. And realistically, the practices that we engage in are meant to strengthen our community as a whole, regardless of that background. Okay. When we think about trauma, I really want to remind us, as an educator myself, I think first about how that's going to impact learning. But I also want to emphasize for folks that may not be directly involved in a classroom or teaching space, that this extends perfectly well to our working spaces as well. So it will also impact the way that we work with others, the projects that we take on. So it affects more than just our emotional responses. And the way that it's often phrased is that these responses engage sort of survival mode, which shuts down our capacity for complex problem solving, for looking at nuance. It tends to exacerbate that feeling of risk that accompanies new tasks. And in particular, when we think about a learning environment, we are inherently asking students to do something that is unfamiliar and risky to them and new. And likewise, taking on challenging projects in a workplace inherently has risk. So there's that feeling of risk that can be exacerbated. In addition, this idea of self-regulation, which I mentioned in the last slide, whether that's to focus on a task, to study, to time manage, to plan and organize, that's often very limited to someone who is experiencing a trauma response, okay? I do also want to mention, though, that it's important to note that even for an individual who has not themselves experienced trauma or is currently not experiencing a trauma response, that as people involved with other human beings, whether in counseling and advising, whether as a teacher, whether as a TA, whether as a colleague, that exposure to the trauma of others, particularly in this past year where many of us are bringing this into our spaces, repeated exposure to trauma can also trigger responses in those that are not traumatized themselves. So often this particular graphic comes from a book targeted at a variety of caring professions, including teaching, social work, psychology, etc., where the repeated exposure to these things without strong boundaries, without adequate stewardship and support can lead to symptoms in the people who are not traumatized themselves. And certainly some of these I identify with: the sense that one can never do enough, the idea of beginning to feel guilt, deliberate avoidance, diminished creativity, and many others. And so we want to think about, as educators, as people who are potentially in leadership roles, supervising a larger team, as members of a campus community, that we need to maintain our own boundaries, but that really is this balance of helping but also managing these crises. And I really like the quote on the right-hand side from the book Trauma Stewardship, where somewhere between internalizing an ethic of martyrdom and ignoring ongoing crises lies the balance that we must find in order to sustain our work. And I really want to emphasize that sustainability piece. So when I think about this idea of stewardship, of creating environments that allow folks to perform at their best, which includes students, but also includes our coworkers, includes ourselves, that we are thinking about creating a system and a community that can be sustained. We are not looking to be saviors of our colleagues or students who have experienced trauma. We are not looking to be the be all and end all. We are looking to create an environment that supports well-being, because supporting well-being supports the possibility of success and growth, okay? And I could talk about stewardship kind of forever, but that's not my goal today. So when I want to talk about sort of this model for how to think about if our workspaces and our learning spaces have individuals who've experienced trauma, how do we start to make decisions that value that respect that, that allow us to mitigate some of that trauma response? And I'm going to use a particular case study example that some of you may be familiar with. When we switched to virtual learning, there was an open question about whether students, or if you don't work in student spaces, whether workshop participants, whether meeting participants should be required to turn on their webcam while attending an online class, while attending a session, etc. Okay, and so there's a few articles about this, lots of opinions out there. The spoiler alert is the short answer is no, never at all. But I'd like to take a look at this particular example as I sort of introduce you to a particular model for trauma-informed decision-making, for how to prioritize and think about whether the choices you're making in your workspace, in your teaching space, are keeping trauma in mind. Okay. All right, so this model from Alex Vanette is called the 4 priorities model. And I really want to emphasize that this is not a checklist. This is not an, if I meet X, Y, and Z, this is how to do it. It is certainly not a one size fits all for any given classroom, for any given workplace. There will be different environmental needs, but this allows you a sense of what are the things that I should be thinking about? Why do these things matter? And how can I implement these priorities in my spaces? Okay, so the 4 that we're going to speak of today are predictability, flexibility, connection, and empowerment. Okay, so I'll start with the first 2 on the left side, predictability and flexibility. So if I want to think about those 2 and why they matter to a trauma-informed practice, predictability is largely because of the idea that trauma can undermine a person's sense of safety and a sense of what's reliable or stable, okay? For flexibility, we really need this piece because trauma responses are not themselves linear or predictable. So there are good days and there are bad days. And so we need to sort of engage in that. So how do these 2 things look in particular a classroom space? And again, I encourage you, I'm going to speak about it largely from classroom spaces, but I do really think a lot of these same principles apply when we think about the organization of our units, our departments, and our working spaces, our working teams. So when I think about predictability, that undermines stability, if we want a trauma-informed approach, we want this to look like making sure that we've established clear routines that can help individuals in our learning spaces and working spaces build a sense of normalcy. You know, what does the start of the week look like for everybody? When are assignments regularly due? How do we start every meeting with the same activity, for example? We also want to think about our own responses. Are we predictable when we address others, when we respond to emails, when we take questions in class? The last one in particular in the predictability is one that I'm sure lots of folks who've taught in spaces are clear on, but also applies to conferences and groups of work colleagues, is to plan ahead for dysregulation. And let me tell you a little bit about what I mean by that. So when we switch gears, for example, from one activity to another, or when we come from something that was particularly exciting, particularly dramatic, etc., we can expect that immediately after that, we're going to experience a brief period of dysregulation before we settle back into some kind of normal. So if you think about it, when I think about a large classroom environment in first year, I'm thinking about the fact that I might have an active learning or discussion-based activity, which will bring a lot of energy into that space, which is fantastic. But I'm not going to expect that immediately after the closure of that activity, that we're immediately going to all settle at the same time and the same pace. So I leave space for that bit of dysregulation so that we can come back together. And likewise, after a serious event has occurred in the world around us, we may expect that our students or our colleagues show up the next day feeling some of that and having less focus. And so being able to plan ahead for that and say, I know these are factors in my space, will help change your expectations for a given class session or a given meeting. Okay. So predictability is one big piece, but flexibility is sort of its counterpoint. While we want to establish these routines, we have to acknowledge that those routines are not always going to function the way that we expect them to. So being able to observe our team in a workplace or our students in a classroom space and adjust our targets and approaches is incredibly important for being trauma informed. And likewise, allowing for multiple paths to, for example, demonstrating learning is a really important piece of allowing for meaningful access to those learning experiences. When I think about that in the context of our webcam sort of example, where do predictability and flexibility play into making the decision to say, no, we're not going to require students to have their cameras on in class? So predictability is about introducing the policies in your classroom to say, you know, this is okay. You can choose on a given day to have it on. I will have mine on regularly, but you don't need to. Being explicit about those policies. But again, the flexibility piece comes in there. Knowing that a student might engage with their webcam because on a given day may depend on their circumstances. So they may actually have family members that are there on a given day. They may not feel particularly well on a given day, and they may choose, even though they've engaged before on another day, to not engage that way. They may have care responsibilities. So all of these factors, giving someone the flexibility to make that decision in the moment, but being upfront about what they can expect from you and in that space is super important. Okay, so let's move to the other two principles. So we've got predictability, we've got flexibility. Now we're going to move to the right-hand side to talk about connection and empowerment. So why are these important in a trauma-informed space? When we think about connection, one of the big things that trauma affects is our connection with other human beings. It disconnects us from each other, and in particular, someone who is experiencing a trauma response may actually perceive neutral messaging, so things that are meant to be what I'm going to put in quotes as objective, they may perceive those as threatening or negative when they were not intended that way, because they are already in a space where their safety is at risk, where they are feeling that fight or flight response. Okay, so connection is particularly important to mitigate those feelings. Again, sort of on the flip side, empowerment. Trauma in particular can feel a lot like a loss of control, or a betrayal of trust by systems meant to protect those individuals. They may feel that loss. So trauma tends to strip away an individual's agency. And so we are looking to kind of combat or mitigate that feeling by the ways that we choose to empower individuals within our teaching spaces, but also within our workplaces. For an employee to have agency and empowerment is equally important to their sense of well-being, their productivity, their ability to be who they are in their workplace. So when I think about what these two principles look like, or what these two priorities look like, when I think about connection, that's about in these spaces, whether that's a workplace or a learning space, that's about investing time, energy, and care in building relationships. And that's both with, for example, our students, so between myself and a student, but also in being a connection builder between others. So as a teacher, that might be building team dynamics and groups so that there are connections between students. As a team leader, that might be building connections between members of my graduate student TA team, etc. Okay, so investing time in those connections so that there is that supportive community network. Remembering as well that those connections extend beyond our classroom. And so we are not the only point of connection. It is not even important that I am a point of connection, but rather that we are leveraging that web of connections that our students and our colleagues already have. It's also valuable, since neutral messages can be perceived quite negatively by someone who is experiencing a trauma response, to actually be deliberately and actively positive rather than merely neutral. And coming from a science background, this one's actually a really challenging one for me to have grown into this practice, because I am so used to trying to be objective, trying to be fair, and recognizing that some sense of unconditional, explicitly positive regard for my students, for my colleagues, for my coworkers, really can go a long way to mitigating the kind of disconnection that we feel as a result of trauma. Shifting gears, if we think about empowerment, what does empowerment look like in classroom and workspaces? One of the biggest things to empowerment is not just offering choices, but offering authentic choices. And I think about that as an educator a lot when I think about if I've designed an assignment for my students and there's a choice. There's a choice between topic A and topic B, but all of the structure, outcomes, and design are equal. It's a little bit of a surface level choice. Likewise, as a team lead in a place of employment, telling people that they could choose to start at 8 a.m. or 9 a.m. is not a big choice. Choosing how they work and the environment in which they work. So for example, working hours from home may be a more significant, more authentic way of offering agency to the team members that we work with. It's incredibly important as well to practice and model consent. So thinking about making sure that I'm asking for consent, that I am asking those questions. And that connects really well with the idea of an opt-in rather than an opt-out policy. And we see a lot of this in technology today, where the default settings do not validate our privacy rights, for example. But also in a lot of cases, the opt-out puts the burden on the person who needs to opt out to have to assert their rights. They are having to put in an extra effort. There are barriers in their way in order to get some fundamental ability to make choices about their own autonomy, their bodies, their decisions, their schedules. And that's incredibly disempowering. That also comes to a lot around in a teaching environment, classroom management policies. And this is one that I'm certainly grappling with a lot, where when we think about the way we design our policies in our classrooms, but also in our workplaces, to think about why we've engaged in those policies. So for example, if we talk about having everybody on mute in a given conversation, we want to make sure that we're doing it because we're making sure we're all on the same page, and not simply because we, as the instructor, wants to maintain control over the situation. So we want to minimize policies that are about compliance just because we want people to behave in a certain way, but rather, if we have policies, we want them to be things that the group has consented to, agreed upon, and is meant to reach those goals, okay? So when I take those two pieces and I move them into our quick example on webcam usage, being able to see other people's faces can be a really key point of connection. But that doesn't necessarily have to be with me. And while I certainly do miss being able to see my students' faces in an in-person teaching environment, I do not believe my comfort with seeing them nod or not should override their ability to choose if they are going to share their space, if they are going to share their own appearance, and their own comfort level. However, being able to talk about how we make connections with each other by seeing each other's faces, our body language, etc., gives folks the choice to say, I would like to do that in small groups, in breakout rooms, in places where I am comfortable. And so giving people that rationale allows them the opportunity to make connection, but also recognizes that connection does not necessarily come with visual cues. So people can make really great connections by chatting with each other in the text messaging chat. And I'm seeing some great comments there from folks who are interacting with each other and connecting. So connection can look like a lot of different things. The empowerment piece is really what it comes down to for this example, is that an individual should have the agency to do that, which also means that by default, the best setting is to have the thing that protects their privacy and then allow them to turn that on at a stage where they choose to, okay? So all four of these priorities, like I said, not all of them will necessarily directly apply as obviously to any given decision making in a classroom space or in a workplace, but they give us some sense of how to go about making these choices, to look at them and say, well, why is this important? Have I thought about how I am empowering or how I am disempowering my students by the choices that I'm making in my classroom? And I really, really want to emphasize this idea that our spaces, our learning spaces and our workspaces are ones that can, in the same way that they can support and mitigate trauma, they can cause trauma. And this is in part why equity really needs to be at the heart of any decision-making or any approach that claims to be trauma-informed. A trauma-aware or trauma-informed approach that does not have equity at its center is more likely to cause trauma, particularly in groups that have been minoritized, that have been biased against by the systems of power and oppression that exist in our society. And so we, as educational institutions, as workspaces, as leaders, can equally cause or exacerbate trauma in the folks in our spaces. And we want to avoid that by being human-centered, by being asset-based. So one of the big things, especially in teaching professions, is this desire to save and help our students, but sometimes that comes from a deficit-based mindset. Oh gosh, they don't have these skills. They have experienced this trauma. I feel for them. But you want to think about looking at that piece and saying, well, everyone comes with assets into this classroom, rather than looking at the deficits and how you can fix those things. We are not fixing our students. We are not fixing our colleagues. We are creating environments in which they can do their best work. Okay, and that is in part why we want our approaches to be proactive. We're not trying to respond when trauma occurs. There are certainly supports out there that are important for those purposes, and referrals that we can make to counseling if someone has experienced an acute trauma. But we want to design from the ground up our workplaces in ways that do not force our students, ourselves, and our colleagues to have to feel that they're making a decision or making a compromise between the way in which they can do their best work and the sacrifice of, well, this is how it is. Okay, and so we really are focusing on bigger systems. And I really want to emphasize that systems focus as well, because this is not a system of self-care. This is not a focus on the individual. This idea of creating a trauma-informed space or resilient community is a community responsibility. It is, each of our contributions matters, but it is not something we do alone. And so it is about creating systems within advising, within classrooms, within working teams that allow that stewardship, that allow that distributed management and responsibility. Because without that, as individuals, we are not sort of able to do nearly as much. Okay, so with that thought, what I want to spend the rest of our time doing is I'm going to actually give you a moment, because I have said so many things. And we're going to take a moment in silence together. And I want you to sit and reflect on that. You can share in the chat if you'd like, but you can also make some notes for yourself. You close your eyes and think about it. From today, what did you notice? What do you wonder? I'm going to give you a second to do that. After that, we're going to go into some groups and give you a chance to digest with some other folks. Okay. All right, so I'm sure I'm interrupting some folks who went on a bit of a thinking journey there. Okay, what I'm going to give you a chance to do now, before we sort of open it up for a broader Q&A, I want to give you a chance to share with a small group, to talk through what things you are wondering, what things you'd like to ask, and hopefully trigger some thoughts. So we're about to send you into some small group breakout rooms. In those spaces, I invite you to turn on your webcam if you feel comfortable to do so, to meet this smaller group of folks, okay? And I want you to take a moment to introduce yourself in whatever way feels meaningful to you, and then share something that you noticed or wondered. I want to remind us that we are coming to this space with a diversity of backgrounds, values, and beliefs. And so a few group discussion norms that I'd invite you to hold in your smaller spaces. One that I love from a variety of workshops that I've attended is the principle of what's said here stays here, while what's learned here leaves here. So if someone happens to share a personal story, I'd ask that you don't reshare that personal story, but rather share the lesson or the reflection that you took away from that. Okay, you can, of course, choose your own level of vulnerability in that space. You don't have to share if you do not want to, but also be conscious of the space that you take up, both in terms of whether you are speaking the entire time or whether you have not yet spoken up and can contribute your own perspective into that space. I encourage you, I know there's some awkwardness as we head into Zoom rooms because there's no obvious order. So if you're stuck for who to go next, choose someone to go first and have them invite the next participant, okay? So we're gonna spend about 12 minutes, maybe 10 minutes in that space together so that you have a chance to digest with some peers. And then we'll come back for some broader Q&A. So before we shift into questions, which hopefully your conversations brought up lots of things that you wondered or wanted to ask, I do want to mention, feel free to reach out to me by email. I am sometimes extremely active and sometimes very avoidant of Twitter, but I am on there as well. Also, that certainly the work that I have presented comes from a variety of sources, many of which I've found incredibly helpful in growing and developing and continuing to learn. So there's a QR code up at the top that links to a list of references and resources, both ones that I used in preparing this presentation, but also ones that expand beyond it. And those will be posted as well along with the recording if you don't grab them today. And info on the upcoming wellness series. But I will turn it over to Melissa, and see if some folks have questions and let Melissa direct that.
All right, thank you, Ying. And so feel free to put your questions into the chat. And as a reminder, if you do unmute yourself to ask your question, it would be recorded. And so I do have a question that has come in already through a direct message, which was this participant likes the opt-in versus opt-out policies idea and wondered if you could expand with some additional examples.
It's a really great question. And I thought about this for a bit. And so I'll start by kind of expanding on the principle behind that in the decision making rather than focusing so much on the example, since I know that depending on your specific context, the kinds of policies that you have that would be meaningful may be really, really different. So when I think about opt-in versus opt-out policies, a lot of that really comes down to this idea of trust and disclosure. So in a lot of cases, policies where when we think about it, there is some default state. There is some sense with an opt-out based policy, you're saying that everyone by default has opted into, for example, having their webcams on, if that's your default setting in Zoom. With opt-out policies around a lot of accommodations, if the default is that everyone gets this unless they specifically ask for accommodation, that changes both in terms of someone being obligated to disclose a certain status, being obligated with the burden of documenting and providing evidence of a certain status. And it also biases towards folks who believe that they have a certain right or privilege. So folks from a variety of backgrounds who either don't know that they have access to those particular supports or who do not want to ask for a variety of cultural or personal reasons will suddenly be disadvantaged by being in that default state. So really what I think about when I think about opt-in versus opt-out policies is who is the default designed for And what is the burden, the additional burden on someone to opt out of that? And how might that default put someone at risk for their safety? I think about that a lot in terms of sort of policies that have any sort of gatekeeping component to them that sort of say who gets in or what's valid. I think about those policies in the way that we've designed gendered bathrooms. And I think about that as well in a teaching context of the ways in which we call on students to participate and the ways in which we offer them feedback. So in some ways, I have not implemented this myself, but I've been thinking a lot about the ways in which I offer feedback to junior teachers, TAs, but also to my students of it is very different to offer a correction to someone in a public space when they feel like they belong there, when they have a self-identity that says, I am a scientist, I am an academic. And it is very different to offer a correction publicly to someone who systemically has been excluded from that space. And so to ask someone, hey, is this a good time to offer feedback on that space, opens the conversation in a very different way. It says, yes, we'd like to have some feedback, but to opt in and offer as well the empowerment to say, is this the moment for you to receive it in which you will receive that well? Is this the kind of feedback that you need as a professional, as a student in this moment? That really sort of connects really well. And the comment in the chat about universal design for learning, a lot of these policies, this is sort of how these principles connect really deeply to policies around equity as well, is that equity and accessibility are a question of who the default state is and why it is that folks have to, why accommodations are not the default, but rather the thing that an individual bears the burden of having to ask for. Absolutely. And just the other comment in the chat from Jenny Godley, ethics. When we ask for participants in research, meaningful consent is an opt-in process. Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. A second question has come to me as a direct message. And so related to the idea of promoting not surface level, but authentic choice and some strategies or tips you might have for how to manage workload while supporting students in that way.
It's a really great question and one that I have not myself managed to find a good answer to. My primary teaching responsibilities are in sort of introductory level, large courses. And the idea of offering authentic choice and meaningful feedback when myself and a co-instructor and our team of TAs are managing 800 students is not something that I have mentally been able to find good solutions for. But one of the things that I sort of am really thoughtful of as I try to grapple with this and as I encourage others to grapple with it is that so many of these questions are not ones that are resolved at an individual level. They are resolved systemically. And so when I think about some of these processes, I think about what it is that our course is asking students to do, what it is, what kind of feedback are they or we expecting to give and receive? And also, how have we allocated resources within our institution? And that's one of the big things that I'm really thoughtful about with workload. When we think about all the different roles that folks in this room are contributing to our community, one of the biggest things that I have heard throughout the course of this past year is the symptoms of burnout, the symptoms of trauma exposure response in individuals in professions like ours, because the supports, the organizational supports were not necessarily there for someone to do their best work, to give the kind of feedback that is meaningful, to offer authentic choices. And so the answer is yes, there are limitations on resources. You may not be able to do all of the things under the sun. But together as a community, the goal is to sort of say, how are we allocating those resources now? Which of those resources that we've allocated within our workspace are allocated towards caring about compliance rather than caring about authentic choice and authentic feedback? And so sometimes the question is doing less, which, coming from a science teaching background as well, where content has historically been king, that is something I struggle with every day, is how to meaningfully give authentic choice that is equitable, that is perceived as equitable, and that is an okay workload for all of the members of my teaching team. And I don't always get it right, but I'm always reflecting on it.
Thank you. That's a great answer. That led to an additional question coming up that was looking at ways to decrease perception of risk. And so you talked about the building relationships and you talked about the authentic choice. Do you have any additional tips or strategies?
Right. So that sense of risk is a really interesting one, and one that I'm trying to also understand in some of my own research. This idea of what are sort of the protective factors that sort of work into that, both for someone who's experiencing a trauma response, but for students in general. And I think part of that comes with that community, that support. Certainly my mentor, Alex Bennett, really has emphasized to me the importance of this really unconditional positive regard. The idea that no matter what grade you get, no matter if you show up late, no matter if you screw up, no matter if you do something that actually is offensive and needs to be corrected and reconciled and apologized for, none of these things change the fact that I have positive regard for my students. And so making that piece really explicit is really important. But likewise, sort of being explicit and talking about what the actual risks are. And Crystal makes a really good point that ties in super nicely to this in the chat, is this idea of one of the things that our system has, and this is from K-12 through to post-secondary, is that we have built a system around grading. And that means very authentically that I can make statements to a student that say, value your learning and don't worry about the grade. But when everything in the system around them, both that they've been trained to value those grades, but also that it has very real impacts that we cannot ignore on their financial well-being, may be tied to their grades. If they fail a course and have to repeat it, there is a financial burden to that, as well as a time burden, as well as a psychological cost. So when I think about those pieces, I think about the fact that, I want to change a perception of risk in my course with one activity, and I can do some of that by talking explicitly about mental wellness. I can do that explicitly by allowing for no penalty extensions. I can do a lot of those smaller policy changes. But like I said, it is very much systemic. If all of their other courses pervasively value their grades, it's a hard fought battle, right? So there are some things that I cannot change, but it does actually make a difference to students, but also to colleagues, to acknowledge the very real fact that while I can say, don't worry about this thing, that there is a reality that student is living and experiencing that is not mine.
Thank you. I would like to let the room know that I'm giving you one more opportunity to pose any questions as we are beginning to wrap up. Kita. Oh, you're muted.
You're muted.
That's what I have everything triple muted because of, yeah, that's how my system works. One of the things that came up in my small group, I come from the student support space. So when students sometimes request and reach out to their instructors, and they're looking for some of this space to breathe, to exist, to finish their courses in a good way. One of the things that I've noticed is they'll often come to me and go, well, I already asked my instructor if I could have a flexible a deferral of a project or something. And these are students that I know because of my work are experiencing trauma, usually intersections of different kinds of trauma. And often they'll come back to me with the feedback that they asked their instructor, and their instructor said, oh, well, that wouldn't be fair. It wouldn't be fair to the rest of the students in the class if you received A, B, or C. And I think for me, it always comes back to that idea of the difference between equality and equity. And what you were speaking to about that unconditional positive regard, where instructors sometimes feel that they need to, in their efforts to be unbiased and to be fair, they can perpetrate harm in these spaces. And I was just wondering if you had something to add to that.
Oh, that was fantastic. The both like touching on the equality versus equity, but like it's certainly something that I am learning to grapple with every day. And COVID has really changed some of the way that I see the ways in which our desire to be fair, and I'm going to put that one in air quotes very heavily, has actually caused, as you say, caused active harm to some of our students, has perpetuated harms that they were bringing into that space and have already lived. And especially it really is contextual, where making the same decision for two students who are in different situations, but also they may be in the same situation, but if one of those students feels like they belong and the other does not, for a variety of sociocultural systemic causes, the person who gets a no, who feels like they already belong, is going to say, okay, well, it's not a big deal, I'll move on. The person who gets the no, who doesn't feel like they belong, it reinforces the existing systems of oppression that they are experiencing and may drive them from the successes that they could have had without that. And so I really, as an instructor, and also in my role as associate head, I deal with a lot of instructors coming to me to say, well, what can I do about this situation? What does the policy say I can do? And I think that's one of the reasons why we need to both be having these conversations amongst course instructors, amongst advising staff. I've learned an enormous amount from the advising staff that I work with because they have a very different perspective than as the instructor. But I think the biggest thing that I want folks to walk away with is this acknowledgement of the power dynamics of all of these situations. That when you are in that position, that you are able to make that decision to offer an extension or not offer an extension, to make those choices, you have power over that student. And they have already put themselves in a vulnerable position by coming and asking for some exception. And they, like the idea that we historically have asked for documentation of illness, let's just move beyond that. Let's just trust in that space. But it is an unfortunately very slow process. And it is one where a student is in a multitude of courses, experiencing a multitude of differing responses to what they might disclose in those spaces. So that's a really, really big piece. And man, I could talk about this for the rest of the day. But thank you for bringing that up, that there is this power dynamic, and that what seems equal is harmful in many situations. So thank you for bringing that. And I do want something came in by private message that I want to address before I leave, and I just want to sort of scroll to find it again, was this sense of disclosure. So I mentioned the word disclosure a couple times when I talk about opt-in versus opt-out policies. And I think I'm really thankful to the campus mental health strategy for beginning these conversations to destigmatize some of these things. And one, I want to be very explicit that no one should have to, student, staff member, colleague, whatever the relationship, no one should be obligated to disclose past, present trauma, mental health status, physical health status. None of these disclosures are something that someone should be forced into. At the same time, we do recognize that because we have systemic and cultural factors that play into stigma around mental illness, that we do not necessarily, particularly as educators who aren't necessarily coming from a social work, psychology, et cetera background, we don't always know how to handle disclosure. And we're working on giving supports to folks for that, because there's been lots of that that's come up. But being able to acknowledge and deal with the fact that disclosure in spaces, even disclosure that has been intentionally chosen by an individual, can cause changes in the relationships between that individual and their peers, that individual and their supervisor, that individual in the classroom. So I have no obvious advice for when to disclose or when not to disclose, other than that there are important privacy boundaries to be careful of and cautious in those cases, and to have specific and explicit individual connections to supports that will back you up in those situations can be really, really important. Like I said, resilience is that community effort. So being alone in a disclosure can be a very, very vulnerable place. So recognizing that we're over time, I'll turn it over to Melissa to wrap us up.
So that concludes the first session of the 2021 Summer Wellness Series. On behalf of the Taylor Institute for Teaching and Learning and the Campus Mental Health Strategy, I want to thank all of the participants who joined us today, and a huge thank you to Ying for facilitating such a wonderful webinar. The recording of this video will be available on the Taylor Institute website, and the facilitator slides will be sent out to all participants within a couple weeks. There are still 2 more webinars in the Summer Wellness Series that are on July 15th and August 19th. Visit the Taylor Institute's website to register in the other sessions. Thank you again to Ying for being with us today, and have a great afternoon, everyone.